All right, thanks everyone for coming out today to listen. Appreciate your time. So I'm going to talk today about a couple recent papers that we've published related to fire regimes in the Madrean Sky Islands of the United States and Mexico. So I'm going to talk about sort of the human influences on these fire regimes, biotic influences, regional patterns, and then talk a little bit about some of the implications of what we found for collaborative transboundary management. I'd like to introduce our team here first. Lots of folks working on this project, and this project's been ongoing for about 5 years now and slowly building. Some folks working on this are Aaron Flesch from the University of Arizona. He's a wildlife ecologist and biologist, focused on birds. Sandra Hare from the Hare Lab in Maine. She's a landscape ecologist, does a lot of work with big data sets and climate data. Pepe Iniguez from the Rocky Mountain Research Station, U.S. Forest Service. He's a fire ecologist. Citlali Cortez Montaño, she's a fire ecologist out of Mexico City. And Raul Romo Leon from University of Sonora, also spatial analysis and remote sensing expert. And Jamie Sanderland, also from Rocky Mountain Research Station. She's a wildlife ecologist, stats specialist. And of course, myself and several other people at the Western Geographic Science Center have contributed to this work, including Caroline Conrad and Travis Poitras. So I want to introduce you first to sort of the broad research questions that we're interested in, and this talks only about a small part of it, but we're interested in how fire regimes are shaped by the landscape, topography, climate, and especially human management and past land use. And then how those fire regimes in turn shape distribution of plant species across the landscape and at the site level, and how those we're eventually trying to link these distributions up with species distributions. And we have, we're working with large data sets on bird and plant plot collections from across the Sky Islands in Mexico and the United States, really trying to dig into the local and sort of broad factors that are contributing to biodiversity in this region and how that relates to fire. We're also interested in linking these dynamics up with human communities and how management might help to sort of ameliorate some of the impacts of fire on vulnerable communities in the region. And so for this talk, I'm really going to focus on this first part here, just looking at the basic descriptors of the fire regimes across this region. So our research questions for this talk are: how do spatial and temporal patterns of recent fires and fire severity vary across the Madrean region? How do recent fire patterns vary across mosaics of human land use and management? And how do recent fire patterns compare to what we know of historical fire regimes in different vegetation community types across this region? What are the differences and what are the similarities, and how is that going to help us sort of inform where we're going to apply management treatments and other conservation activities? So I wanted to talk a little bit about the study area if you're not familiar with the Sky Islands, and I thought I'd start with some photographs here. It's a pretty diverse, biodiverse region. We've got mixed conifer and spruce, the higher elevation mountain ranges, lower elevation desert communities, sort of a lot of in-between woodlands and grasslands support high species diversity. And across the region, we have a diversity of people, of course. We've got United States and Mexico within the region, and tribal nations within the region. There are a lot of issues related to connectivity of habitats across the Madrean region, especially around the border area where we have things like border fence that are impeding movement of wildlife and basically impeding conservation activities across the region. This is a picture in the center here of a jaguar, a very popular species in the region who travels back and forth between the United States and Mexico within these Sky Islands. The map up here to the left is the location of the region, and it's interesting because it's a mixture of a lot of the different surrounding ecoregion and biotic influences of the Rocky Mountains to the north and the Mogollon Rim, The Sierra Madre Occidental to the south. So there's species of conifers sort of intermix in these Sky Island mountain ranges. And then to the east and the west, we have desert influences of the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts in the grasslands at the lower elevation. So it's considered a biodiversity hotspot because of these mixtures. And it's, as I mentioned already, it's culturally diverse with Mexico, the United States, a lot of tribal nations. It's generally a rugged landscape. It's rural, not heavily populated, but there are some localized centers of population. And there's a lot of extractive land uses across the region. In total, the ecoregion is about 75,000 square kilometers, and over half of that is made up of these Sky Islands. So the map in the center shows the Sky Islands outlined. We have 17 Sky Island ranges down in Mexico, and then 22 north in the United States, and this gray line here is the international border that divides the region. The photos on the right show an example of a fire, and this is in the Chiricahua Mountains, and you can see the stark differences between the forested and woodland vegetation surrounding grassland and desert areas in these Sky Islands. And also note that they're pretty rugged topography in these areas, a lot of high relief. They go up in elevation pretty quickly, and here's an example on the bottom right of a patch of high severity burn in that same fire at the Chiricahuas. So one thing that's interesting about the region, interested us when we started working on this project, is that there's some known differences in the fire history between the US and Mexico. These graphs in the center here are based on tree ring data showing the occurrence of fire through time. The top graph is from the Santa Catalina Mountains here, that's just north of Tucson. And the tree rings and fire scar data from those mountains show pretty common pattern to what we see in most of the Western United States. And what we see going back into the 1600s, for example, here, the vertical ticks are your dates of fires, and we see pretty frequent fire within these mountain ranges up until about 1900, when, of course, changes in land use, grazing, and fire suppression started to reduce those fires greatly. So that's a story across the West. But we also knew from a couple of sites just south of the border, like this one here below in the Sierra Los Ajos, and other studies throughout northern Mexico, that there are areas that had continued to burn during that period in the US that saw the fire suppression. So this example here on the top is from Sierra Los Ajos, where there were continued occurrences of fire into the 1950s of the 20th century. So that indicates that there's some differences in management and land use and ignition sources in these areas that warrant further investigation. Also interesting in the study area is the major differences in current land management and land tenure. We did a little paper here recently, this is in 2019, looking at sort of the distribution of different management units and how that would influence conservation across this region and across the border. It's creates some difficulties, but there's also a lot of promise for transboundary conservation. But the main thing to look at here is in the north, in the United States, these are the different land management types. Most of the Sky Islands in our region are managed by the Department of Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service, a lot of Park Service, Department of Interior Lands, Bureau of Indian Affairs, but very little private land in the Sky Islands. And this contrasts greatly with Mexico to the south. So this light colored yellow here is all private land in the Sky Islands. The sort of mustard yellow here are ejido lands, which are communal owned lands, also in these mountains. And there's very little sort of classic protected areas like national parks within the Sky Islands. In fact, there are none of them, but there are these purple areas here that are considered national protected areas in Mexico. And that's just a status granted to these areas. It's not a management unit by any means. It's just the status of the land that are sort of overlaid on top of either a private land parcel or a ejido, communal ejido lands. So very different situation going on in Mexico compared to the US in terms of ownership and management. Okay, so We decided that to get a better grasp on recent fire regimes in this region, we had to first map the fires in Mexico, which did not exist up until our study. This is a screen grab here of the MTBS database, which most of you are probably familiar with. It's the monitoring trends in burn severity, and it provides great data sets on historical fires going back through the Landsat era, through the 1980s. Things like fire perimeter and burn severity through the DNVR. You can download all this for all the recent historical fires in the United States. But of course, that doesn't exist for Mexico or Canada. So we sought to create a product that was similar to MTBS for the Sky Islands in Mexico. And our approach to find the fires first was kind of a little bit of a detective work. We could use MODIS data, which is 250 meter data. They have something called thermal anomalies data set, which identifies fire pixels. We use those to kind of identify potential fires across the mountains in Mexico. And that goes back to about 2000. And based on that data, we digitize fire scars from Landsat imagery, as you can see here on the bottom. And then prior to 2000, going back to the Landsat data to 1984, we went through and basically investigated almost every scene of Landsat in these mountains in Mexico and found the fire scars, digitized those polygons, and then created products similar to MTBS, which is the difference normalized burn ratio, which is a Landsat index that gives you an estimate of fire severity within these polygons. And one thing I'd like to note is this example here is a fire, pre-fire in May, fire scar, you can see it burning in June. And then a year later in June, we picked the post-fire image. And that's a little bit different than how MTBS does it. Sometimes MTBS in the United States has post-fire images immediately after the fire. And that could be a very different metric than a year after the fire, which gives you sort of a better estimate of like long-term impacts of the burn on these vegetation types. So we went back and calculated these same extended assessments for all of the polygons, MTBS polygons in the United States as well, or in the Sky Islands of the United States. And if you're interested in these data, they're available online through Sciencebase, the USGS websites here. You can just search up fire perimeters, Sky Islands, U.S. Mexico, get the perimeters and the DNVR. So we posted those up. If anyone is interested in doing their own studies, feel free to download. That'd be great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about an overview of the regional fire patterns we saw. And then I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the indicators of human influences on fire patterns and fire severity. Talk about some of the biotic influences on fire patterns and fire severity, and then talk a little bit about some of the transboundary conservation issues in the region. Okay, so here are the initial results of the mapping effort. These graphs on the bottom are broken up by the United States and Mexico. Mexico's on the bottom. On the x-axis, we have year, the year of the fire. The graphs on the left are the number of fires. Graphs on the right are area burned per year. And overall, across the region, both countries, all Sky Islands, we mapped 335 fires. And this is just about 10,000 kilometers square of land, square kilometers of burned land. And 25% of this burned area burned more than once during the period. So that's quite a bit of reburning. But if we look at all sort of the flammable area within these mountain ranges, what we see in terms of area burned is only about 28% of the steady area burned across 32 years. That's actually not that much. In terms of patterns between the US and Mexico, pretty similar patterns. We didn't see any major differences. We see a lot more fires in the US Sky Islands in terms of counts, which is a little surprising because the Sky Island area and the number of Sky Islands in the US is it's a little bit smaller than Mexico. But general patterns, and these fire patterns are pretty synchronous across the major fire years: 89, 1994, 2002, 2011, 2017. In general, burned area trends were pretty similar, with the exception of this is 2011 here, with a Horseshoe 2 fire, for example, burning over 100,000 hectares. A big fire here in the US, not as big in Mexico. Then in recent years, up to 2017, we're seeing a lot more fire activity in Mexico in recent years. Okay, the map on the left here shows fire size. The dot size is related to the size of the fire. So the red and the orange are sort of bigger fires. And we see some of the bigger fires occurring in these sky islands of the US, and a few in these more remote islands of Mexico, but generally smaller and medium-sized fires. Some areas have a lot more fire activity than others. And we found by looking at the Palmer Drought Severity Index on this graph here at the right, which is a measure of drought, a spatial data set. The orange is higher drought conditions that year of the fire. The green is wetter conditions. We generally saw, when we looked at fire size, we saw up here, most of those larger fires across this time period occurred during those drought years. That's not entirely surprising. And fire size is generally smaller in sort of the wetter years. That makes a lot of sense too. Not as much dry fuel out there. But we're also seeing in recent years, drying trend, more heavy drought years in recent times, which of course is concerning across the region. Okay, this map over here to the left is interesting. This is the number of burns per sky island, and the red here is up to 5 burns in 4, 3, 2, 1. The blue is just a single burn. So this is showing the distribution of those reburns I talked about, where 25% of the total area burned had burned more than once across the period. And I think this is a very interesting map. This shows that a lot of those reburns, 3 and 4 burns, are happening in some of these sky islands in Mexico to the south. Los Ajos, El Pinito, especially have sort of frequent fire regimes continuing. A lot of fire activity across the border and a lot of variation across the border as well, right up along the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, looking at fire severity, so how severe was each fire across each sky island? This box plot here showing the distribution of those DNBR values of fire severity across this gradient from north to south, from Santa Teresa up here down to La Huerta further south. And generally what we saw is the DNBR were fairly low on average across the sky islands. So not a ton of, these aren't all high severity fires, but there are some high severity outliers, of course. And most of those were more common in the higher elevation northern sky islands in the US. And those are these outliers here: Chiricahua, Catalina, Pinaleño. Many people are familiar with some of the recent fires in those areas. But as we move further south, and especially along the border where we're seeing a lot more different fire activities, we're seeing a lot more variation in fire severity, more low severity fires, a lot of interesting stuff going on. And as we get further south into Mexico, a little less variation in fire severity, but far fewer higher severity fires in the farther southern sky islands. Okay, so I want to talk about some of these human influences on the fire regimes for a bit here. I'm going to walk you through some data here. It's going to look a little crazy, but just bear with me. I'm just going to talk about it. If we look at a transect through the region from north to US, south to Mexico, and we look at the distribution of fires per sky island, we see some patterns that are really indicative of sort of a human fingerprint on them. Starting north in the Rincon Mountains, which is it's next to Tucson, but it's considered relatively remote. Sky Island, there's no roads up there you have to hike in, so there's obviously not a lot of people up there. Most of the fires up there would be lightning ignitions, and sometimes National Park Service would do prescribed burns up there. But the distribution of fires here in red over time shows, pretty moderate size, small, medium size, well scattered throughout the time period. But as we move south into more populated areas like the Huachuca Mountains near the U.S. Mexico border here, we see a lot more smaller fires, a lot more frequent fires, and multiple fires per year. And especially here in 2011, we saw multiple fires across that range. And this is starting to indicate more of the human influence on these areas. If we move south border to the Atascosas, just west of Nogales here, we especially see a lot different sort of fire dynamics going on in terms of the dates of the fire and the size. We didn't see a lot of fire early in the time period for these mountains, but starting in about 2000, we see a lot more fire activity that likely corresponds with a growing population in Nogales in that area. And then again, as we move further south into Mexico, to these more remote areas, we see far fewer fires, a little bit smaller and medium-sized fires in those areas as well. Now, this graph here is, to me, more interesting and more telling of the human influence. These red dots here, of course, the fires. And on the x-axis here, we have the time of year of each fire. And so in the rincons further north, again, this more remote island, we see the fires occurring within sort of your typical fire season, which would be, early summer through the monsoon period here. But as we move south to the Huachucas, a lot of these fires are occurring really early in the season, practically in the winter and spring. So this is indicating some of those fire starts are probably from campfires, people keeping warm. There's a military base there as well that's probably causing some ignition sources in that. And far fewer later in the sort of monsoon period of the year. Heading south of the border again into Mexico near Nogales, we're seeing fire ignition dates across the year. So a lot of early season fires and some late season fires too. So pretty highly dynamic timing of ignition there. And then again, further south in the remote areas, we see more of a typical pattern of ignition times in the typical fire season. Okay, so we also want to look at the influence of population density on some fire attributes, and we use something called anthropogenic biomes, and this is basically taking the concept of a biome and applying information on population density within those different biomes. So for example, you have a populated forest. One example would be the Santa Catalina Mountains, where you have a lot of summer cabins up there. Higher population density compared to a place like the Pinaleño Mountains over here, where you have essentially no human footprint. And in the rangelands, which would be more like the woodland types in the region, you have residential rangelands, which would be a place maybe like Nogales, where you have higher population density on the edges of the Sky Islands. And then more remote rangelands where there's very little human footprint. And this is a global data set that we used, and we're just looking at the Sky Islands here, but it turned out to be pretty useful for characterizing differences in some of these vegetation types and population densities. So what we found is, in general, that the fire size was larger in more remote areas, and this makes a lot of sense. So the further out you are, the less impulse there is to suppress these fires. So the remote forests and the remote rangelands tend to have larger fires, and fires closer to these populated areas, populated forests, populated rangelands, tend to be smaller, likely because they were suppressed early because they were endangering property. However, if we look at the severity of the fires, on average, fires were more severe near these populated areas. So populated forests and populated rangelands, for example, tended to have higher severity fires than their remote counterparts. And that's interesting and indicates to me that these areas where there are settlements across the region tend to have probably more historical suppression and therefore more fuels buildup, leading to higher severity fires in those areas. And again, we saw pretty big differences in fire date between remote areas and these populated areas, with populated areas in this case having ignition starts later in the season on general compared to the remote areas. Okay, now I will talk about the biotic influences. I'll describe a little bit. We looked at these fire patterns across these different vegetation types, and if you're familiar with the Sky Islands, they follow a pretty classic profile of grasslands at the lower elevations up to oak woodlands, pine oak woodlands, ponderosa pine forests, fir forests, subalpine at the top typically. And the center map shows distribution of those vegetation types in the Sky Islands. And a couple things to note, much of the spruce-fir forest and the mixed conifer are occurring strictly in the United States at these higher elevation points in the U.S. and the Chiricahuas, Pinaleños, and Catalinas, and there's none of that in Mexico really. The major vegetation type across the region is this Madrean evergreen forest and woodland. That's this sort of army green color here. That's our primary type. And then in Mexico, in sort of these cooler, moister, higher elevation areas of Mexico, you have this pine oak forest in light green, and that's only in Mexico, not in the US. And we investigated the distribution of these types according to sort of their climatic environments using principal components analysis on the climate normals from PRISM, sort of look at some of the differences and where these types are occurring. Okay, so for each vegetation type, we established a historical fire regime type for them based on the literature. A lot of the paleo data, tree ring data, other historical reports, this sort of pieces of information came together, and we established for our main vegetation types some of the fire regime characteristics like fire frequency. So for spruce-fir, they're relatively infrequent, say 30 to 100 year fire frequency there. High severity percent average patch size, generally higher in spruce-fir than other types, and percent high severity. And then the recovery times for each vegetation type. And then we mix conifer, frequent fires, less high severity, for example, going down the line here to grasslands where we have more frequent fire regimes from 2 to 10 years, for example. A lot more high severity because it's grass and it's almost all completely removed during a fire. So we set these up as a baseline to compare the recent fire regimes from the 1980s to the present to see how they sort of conformed or diverged from what we expected from the historical estimates of these fire regimes. Okay, so across this area from our remote sensing data set, we found some interesting stuff. So spruce-fir forests, for example, at the higher elevations, they don't occupy a lot of land in the Sky Islands, 7 square kilometers, but of that area, 6 of them burned. So 90% of the spruce-fir burned during the time period. So it's quite a bit. Same with mixed conifer forests. We have about 87% of the mixed conifer in the study region burned in this 30-year time period. And this pine oak forests, which occur strictly in Mexico, 64% of those burned during the time period. And that's about 1,500 square kilometers. The Madrean evergreen forest and woodlands, again, our main vegetation type. It's pretty common throughout the region, over 20,000 square kilometers. Not as much as that burned as would be expected given its distribution, so only 27%. And as we get into the grasslands and some of these other types that don't burn as much, we're seeing pretty minimal burning across the region. So just to break out a few sort of key points that we found here, and I want to talk about some of these vegetation types that diverged pretty seriously from what we know of their historical fire regimes, and then some examples of where the vegetation and fire regimes kind of conform to historical. Now, the first one is this mesic high elevation forest, the mixed conifer and spruce forest, which I mentioned, 90% of that burned. These are occurring in the cooler, wetter environments of the US. The characteristics in terms of severity match historic, so it's a lot of high severity fire, and we're seeing that. But we found that many of these areas burn multiple times, which is surprising. So that fire frequency is much higher than expected. That 100-year period that we thought, based on the historical fire regime, we're starting to see multiple fires within a 20-year period. So it's much more frequent and expected and problematic. There's obviously not going to be time for regeneration in these areas, and a lot more fire than expected. The Madrean evergreen forest and woodlands, again, this is the most common type, and this is diverging from our historical understanding of the fire regimes here. It's more than half the total area in the study region, and a lot of it burned, but still this is only 27% of the total flammable area in the Sky Islands. So we consider this to be a fire deficit. So there should be more fire in this type under historical conditions. It's generally lower than historical across all land ownership and management types, with the exception of some Department of Interior lands. We saw quite a bit of a fire on U.S. Forest Service lands and less on private lands and ejido lands in Mexico with this type. And so the thought is that one of the limiting factors of fire in these areas are probably grazing or overgrazing that's reducing the abundance of fine fuels that would typically carry fire across these woodlands. Grasslands also diverged from historical expectations. Typically, grasslands would have been a frequent fire regime, 8 to 10 year return interval. These are important for sort of moving fires into the woodlands and upper elevations historically, but we weren't seeing a lot of fire in the grasslands of the lower elevations of the Sky Islands. So only 18% burned during the study period, but some areas that did burned within the historical range of fire frequencies, and those tended to be in areas managed for fire, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, areas near the Buenos Aires, for example, or the Malpai borderlands area, where there's a lot of collaborative fire management in the grasslands there to improve grazing conditions. So there's some upsides there in the grasslands, but in general, we're seeing much less fire than historical. Okay, then finally, the one vegetation type where we saw characteristics similar to historical fire regimes, the pine oak forest in Mexico. Now, again, these are found in wetter and cooler environments in the upper elevations. 64% burned, and a lot of it burned within that historical fire frequency. So we saw 3 to 4 burns in a lot of these mountaintop areas. However, one thing of concern is that some of the severity was higher than expected. So these should generally be low severity fires, but we did see some high severity fires in recent decades in these areas, which is a little concerning. Most of the fires we saw were in those protected areas, designated protected areas, which happen to be at the higher elevations. And we saw less frequent fires on communally owned ejido lands compared to private lands. So there's some opportunity there in thinking about sort of continuing on these fire regimes in these areas to work with landowners to bring awareness to this sort of unique burning and vegetation type in Mexico. All right, how am I doing on time? I've got a couple of minutes here. So just a few slides here about the implications of these findings for management and transboundary collaborative fire management in the region. So first off, I think in terms of management implications, those high elevation mixed conifer forests are of major concern because we're seeing a lot of burning and a lot of high severity burning in those areas. That obviously should be a focus of management. These maps here on the right show some models from a recent paper that's in review that we did, looking at the distribution of different pine species across the region. Some of these areas in red here, you can see those upper elevation areas. There's very limited distribution of some of these pine species in the mixed conifer areas of those Sky Islands to the north, and that's of concern. So it could really limit the distribution and regeneration of some of these pine species, and that also has cascading effects on wildlife. Spotted owl, Mount Graham red squirrel is a classic example of where high severity fire and repeated fires are imperiling their distributions, very limited distributions in the penelangias. So these areas are at risk of type conversion and total habitat loss, and could really be a focal area for fire restoration. And climate change is also expected to play a role in these vegetation types and changes in these vegetation types in the future. And that kind of compounds with changes in fire regimes, expected changes in fire regimes in the future that could impact big impacts on connectivity of habitat, regional connectivity, and such things. And so these two maps on the right are an example of changes in habitat connectivity models for black bears in the region. Black bears are threatened and considered threatened in Mexico, not in the U.S., but they travel throughout the Sky Islands into Mexico. And these main habitat patches up to the north, in the Mogollon Rim, and then south in the Sierra Madre Occidental, are connected, through these Sky Islands. And a lot of these areas are places that we expect to see high severity fires currently and in the future. Now, if we bring projected changes in habitat due to climate change, looking into 2060, we see a major reduction in habitat area and major reduction in connectivity of some of these habitat patches due to those sort of compounding influences. So looking at these type of models for jaguar, for bears, for other species, we can start to identify sort of the important linkages across the region in these Sky Islands that could provide connectivity and start to focus and find priority areas for management. In terms of humans, obviously, there are a lot of underserved communities in the borderlands, especially in Mexico, that are vulnerable to fire and post-fire effects. There's just not the resources to combat fires or the resources to react to fires when they occur. So these could be obvious focal areas for reducing fuels and other activities. And we saw from our research, borderlands tend to have the most sort of variable fire regimes, a lot of high severity fire, different times of ignitions related to sort of human activities in these areas. Areas that are populated tend to have higher fuel accumulation due to suppression and thus greater risk of higher severity fires. Then human ignitions are also more common in these areas. And here's an example, this map here, of some modeling that we did on fire probability based on scenarios of human ignitions based on historical ignitions, and then compared to burn probability based on just strictly lightning alone. You can see that those patterns change pretty significantly between human ignitions and lightning. And these are other modeling strategies that we have available to identify areas at risk and sort of focus on our management and conservation of these areas. Finally, there's been a lot of effort at international cooperation in firefighting across the region. So this example, and the Alamo fire across the border here, U.S. Mexico firefighters got together and sort of suppressed the fire in areas and controlled it, and did a good job going across the border and working on it together. And these are great stories of the two countries working together. It'd be nice to see a little more coordination, prioritization of fuels reduction projects, because we know these are going on in the U.S. Along the border, for example, and they're also going on in Mexico along the border. This map here shows a couple of the recent prescribed and controlled burns going on along the border in U.S. Mexico. Coordinating those and working with conservation groups in the region who are already working on these issues, the Malpai Borderlands Restoration Network, and other groups could be very beneficial for reducing fuels and reintroducing fire into some of these areas. All right, so in conclusion, just a couple points. This research gives the first look at contemporary fires that include Mexico in this region. Woodlands and Grasslands had a fire deficit and should be focal areas for fire restoration. High elevation forests in the U.S. burning too frequently, also concern and focal areas for restoration treatments. The human influence is apparent across the region, and the borderlands in particular show the greatest fire variation. And this is concerning given high population density in the area and vulnerability of some of those communities. And then finally, promoting connections between different groups across the U.S.-Mexico border is essential really for sustaining these landscapes and creating sort of fire-adapted communities in the area. All right, so that's about it. These are the two papers. If you're interested in reading more, they're both open access. One's in the Journal of Fire Ecology, and this one to the right from 2020 is in a special issue of Air, Soil, Water Science, and this is a special issue on Sky Island restoration. So a great series of papers in that special issue if you want to look into other factors of the Sky Island region as well. And then also one other note, we've been translating all of our papers into Spanish. So if there are people interested in reading in Spanish, or others in Mexico, we're trying to get the word out there as well on the science. So those are all available as supplementary materials. And that's it. So happy to take any questions. And if you want to reach out to me, there's my email bottom.
Well, thank you so much, Miguel. That was great. You covered a lot of territory in what I found was a clear and sort of progressive way. So I could follow along well. Thank you.
Good.
So yeah, feel free to type questions in the chat window. I've tried to put links directly to some of the papers that Miguel mentioned. But if you want to share other resources or anything else in the chat window, feel free. I think we could handle unmuting. Everyone is welcome to unmute themselves. So if it's easier to ask a question verbally, you can do that. And while we're waiting for other folks to either type in or unmute, I had a question. You mentioned that you took a slightly different look at the burn severity, going back kind of to some of your earlier slides, looking at MTBS and kind of creating a similar data set for Mexico. And as someone who uses those data sets fairly regularly but doesn't interrogate them maybe as closely as you did, I'm curious about whether you saw notable changes when you moved to that year-long burn severity assessment, particularly in things like chaparral or grasslands, where sometimes the ravage data set, which is similar to the MTBS, calculates like a complete canopy loss or something in grasslands, which is always a little bit hard to understand. Well, wait a minute, what does that really mean? So not to like dive too deep into the data processing weeds, but I'd be curious if you had any particular comments on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. We didn't do an actual comparison between those initial assessment and what we did the extended assessment to see what those differences are. We just decided to, I mean, our main focus was really in the, forest and woodland types. So we felt the extended assessment was appropriate to use and wanted to make sure that that was consistent across the board. But it's an excellent point that in the grasslands, yeah, those can fully recover the next growing season. But that's not always the case either. We've got a study, some studies in the grasslands at Buenos Aires, for example, and we do see, sometimes it takes, 3 or 4 years for those areas to fully recuperate fuels. So an extended assessment, I think, would pick up some of that as well in the grasslands. Yeah,
that's really interesting because, I sort of make the naive assumption that, the lower stature vegetation is going to recover, but maybe that's a bridge too far.
Yeah, well, in some cases they want, people want to remove some of that grass, invasive grasses and mesquite and things like that in those lower elevations. It's really, it's a management goal is to remove some of that cover.
Yeah. And the extended assessment might capture that better and see how we're doing a little better. Well, I'm surprised that my colleagues like Ellis and Pepe, who always seem to have questions, haven't chimed in yet.
Chime in, guys.
I guess I'll continue because I had another one. Apologize for abusing my facilitator privilege, but feel free, other folks. You talked, the human ignitions portion seems to be important. I mean, that image you had of lightning versus human ignitions really being almost completely different, I thought was pretty useful. And I guess, could you help parse out for me a little bit some of the, I mean, some of those ignitions, maybe even if not controlled burns, they may be planned, they may be things people are doing for management purposes, like you said, getting rid of mesquite or something, versus completely accidental, you know, or even arson or something. And I mean, maybe that's splitting hairs, maybe that doesn't matter, but I guess I'd be curious if you had any comment on that.
Well, that those graphs are actually from, I think it's the short data set, which is ignitions data set. It's a point-based data set, and each ignition has a specific ignition source attributed to it. And so we carefully looked at those ones actually, and almost all of those are not from prescribed fire. Human ignitions in that case would be accidental, campfires, so those sort of ignition sources.
And those were all on the U.S. side, right?
Yeah, that was all in U.S. And there is a similar data set that Pepe found actually for portions of Mexico, but not as comprehensive. It'd be nice to have a little more information on what the ignitions are there, because in Mexico, especially, I think a lot of the fires, ignition sources might be agricultural burning and things like that going on, which is probably less common in the U.S. But.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of where I was headed with that. That it's a little bit different. To obviously, we want to eliminate accidental human ignitions, but the agricultural burning might fall into a different category where it needs to be accommodated or built in.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, it looks like Pepe and Miles have unmuted. I think I saw Pepe unmute first, so we'll go with you, and then we'll turn to Miles.
Oh, I didn't have a question. I was just going to say, you know, that yeah, I think some of the stuff that we're doing in northern Mexico is really interesting, but I think that there's a lot more stuff that the Mexican researchers and managers could really use to kind of expand this work into Mexico in terms of MTBS. And there are groups in Mexico working on it, but I think that there could be a lot of more sharing of this kind of resources, and like a Mexican MTBS, I think is a lot of people have that idea, but I think turning it into a reality. But I think in the next 10 years or 5 years, I think that's definitely possible. Miguel's already doing some of it in northern Mexico, but you get into the southern part of Mexico and it becomes a little crazier when you're looking at tropical forests and stuff like that. But I think that, yeah, kind of like, you know, more collaboration, I think, between the U.S. and government, you know, I think is a very good thing, especially, I think, in terms of like managing fire. I think this idea of more prescribed fire and less suppression of fire in Mexico, I think it would be a good thing. I think that we have a lesson that we've learned in the U.S. and in Mexico. I think the Mexican authorities haven't really kind of learned from our mistake, I think. And I think that would be a good thing if they do. I mean, because there are only limited forests in the world, and I think that we got to try to do whatever we can to save most of them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point too, Pepe, which I didn't totally mention, but the MTBS obviously stops at the U.S. Mexico border, and that was an issue for our research. But you know, almost every other data set does too, and that's a major issue. Why there are not better transboundary spatial data sets on vegetation, you know, things that we take for granted in the U.S. when we're doing our research projects just don't exist, you know, south of the border, and that's an issue that I think hopefully we can get resolved here in the near future, because, you know, it's an ecoregion. It's a continuous thing. We don't have these false borders in the ecoregion. We're thinking about species distributions and things like that.
Miles, did you want to chime in with a question? Looks like you're
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I just want to expand quickly on what Pepe just said about cross-border collaboration. And here's just a short anecdote, but in 2018, we were doing the 5-year Diamond Day / Gray Ranch vegetation monitoring. And the year before, there had been huge fires in the Sierra San Luis. And we started seeing black bears every day on the ranch. And having worked there for nearly 20 years, I had never seen one bear, and even people who lived on the ranch hadn't seen bears. But following these fires, it just appeared as though they moved up the Sierra San Luis and Sierra Madre into the Palencia and Animas Mountains. And so, you know, having some cross-border collaboration on, you know, monitoring wildlife on both sides of the border, I think it'd just be a really, really good thing to look at, because all of these dynamics could be driving predator-prey, jaguar distribution, et cetera. So, yeah, I'm just glad that Pepe brought that up.
Yeah, thanks. That's a neat anecdote. Yeah, pretty cool to see that influx of bears.
Yeah, and then a question I had for you, Miguel, was have you observed a change in the biotic community extent in, for example, the Madrean evergreen woodlands or the semi-desert grasslands? Like, I know at the higher elevations, we've seen a lot of reduction in the conifer forests throughout the Sky Islands, but I'm curious, you know, like, has there been an expansion or a decrease in Madrean evergreen woodlands, since that's the most dominant community there? It covers the most extent of the land, and arguably potentially some of the most productive areas for wildlife because of acorn masting and a lot of energy being produced there. So I'm just curious if you've seen any changes.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, one of the real limits of our study here, and this goes back to having good data sets again, is that we were sort of stuck using a static vegetation map data set for our analysis. So we didn't get to really look at, you know, changes after fire and these different vegetation types and how they might be responding to those fires. So we don't really have any information on that. So I don't have a good answer for that. But you know, that's obviously a great research question right there, and it's something that could be answered with, you know, some mapping efforts. We do have one of the slides I showed was that pine species distribution modeling that we've done for all of the Sky Islands, and that's based on field data. So we've created models from these transboundary data sets that Aaron Flesch and the folks at the Forest Service have collected. So we could use that type of data to start to better map these community types across the region and look at those changes over time.
Great. Let's see, we've got a question that came in from Ellis, and then maybe we'll try to wrap up here. So Ellis asks, Miguel, can you confirm that it seemed the largest human influence on fire suppression in Mexico was actually grazing versus active suppression?
Can I confirm that? I cannot. That is, yeah, that's really just a wild guess there. We have looked at in the past the, you know, expenditures on suppression in northern Mexico, and you know, by the government, and it's pretty minimal. So we know that's not a major factor there. But assuming, you know, grazing, Ejido areas are more heavily grazed probably than private lands and upper elevation things. I think it's a safe bet to think that grazing is one of the main sort of suppression forces in that region. But yeah, I can't confirm that. That's something that actually another thing that we're working on too, Raul at University of Sonora and a postdoc, we're starting to look into doing interviews with landowners across the Sky Islands in Mexico to get a better understanding of sort of the land uses and what happened in the past in those areas, which is, you know, really an unknown at this point.
Great. Yeah, sounds like a really interesting question to parse that out. Well, we're back at the top of the hour, so we should thank everybody. I'm really glad we had a good turnout today. And Miguel, thank you so much for a great presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share this. It's really useful to get the detailed science and links to kind of the papers and more information. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Great. And hopefully we'll see you all, at least some of you next week on our webinar next week as well. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.